Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and The Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by Abby, who's a beginning photographer from California. Abby says he went out on an early morning bike ride with a friend in downtown LA. They were riding along and he saw this real dramatic lighting pattern on the church and wanted to stop and take this picture. Realized there was no CF card in the camera and asked his friend if he could borrow his friend's camera. Let me go ahead and give you the metadata. His friend had a Nikon D80 with an 18-55 VR lens mounted on it. Abby zoomed to 22 millimeters. Effective focal length is a short, is sort of a semi-wide here, around 32-33 millimeters. At f11, exposed the file for 1/400th of a second. Abby says that it was the lighting pattern on the church that got his eye, but once he started to try and frame this, he then quickly thought of the idea of including a person walking in from camera right. And very quickly, not long after that, this elderly gentleman walked up, started across the street, and the fact that they were wearing white moved into the light and seemed very dramatic in the bottom right-hand corner made Abby feel like he had the shot that he wanted, and then went on. And Abby said that he titled a Sunday morning visit to the church, and I'm just mentioning that because one of the neat things about our new submission form is we do have a lot of backstory information, and it helps me to critique an image when I know sort of what the intent is. So it's very obvious that this is a story-based image, and the character you're seeing in the bottom right-hand corner is the main subject of this image. I want to go out of order here and just mention a technical thing here. This is one of these things where you might think it's just to master the obvious thing, and then you may just go back to saying I don't need to do that. And I'm not picking on Abby here at all. We've all been there where we don't have the CF card. We don't have the battery. We have the battery, but it's just not charged, and neither is the backup, or the backup's not there. We don't have the one lens that we'd like to use for a certain type of shooting. Please, if you're hearing my voice, the next time you get a break, go into your computer and create an equipment checklist document. Print it out, have it quadruple laminated, punch a hole in it, take a tie, and tie this thing to your camera bag and get in the habit of looking at that the night before you go out to shoot. You may need to make a couple of different lists. You might think I've only got one camera and it's a point and shoot, and so I don't need to do this. Wrong. You need to do it. And this is a very basic technical thing. If you come up with the equipment checklist and get into the habit of looking at this, then this kind of problem will go away. And it's just a technical thing you can take care of. I can totally see Abby being drawn to this scene. I mean, I do love the pattern, and part of the reason why I love it is there's a beautiful quality of line, and not only that, we talked about in the last critique how this diagonal moving from the top left to bottom right hand corner is the easiest line of visual movement that you can suggest, imply, or create in a framed shot. And Abby has that as part of the visual design here, and the way it's been framed, and just the fact that he sees it to begin with. And then when you add this character coming in and moving into the light and leaning in, all of this works in a very, very powerful way from a design standpoint. I love the fact that Abby has framed this from top to bottom where there's some space down here. To me, this is just sort of a stage, the bottom part of the image, and I like the way it's been framed where there's a nice base for the movement and down in this part of the image. I love the fact that Abby converted this to black and white. One of the things I'd like to do is simplify this even more, but getting rid of the color here is going to help to pay off the main character and the main idea in the image. And the overall framing, I think, is working really well here. And when I think about perfect world improvement for this image, I'd like to simplify it even more. And there are a couple of things that I want to say about that before I just show a couple of changes that I made to the image. This part of the image over here is pretty simple and pretty graphic, and from a contrast standpoint, this idea really stands out. The issue that I have is that once I come out into the rest of the image, there's an enormous amount of local and global contrast. And without sort of drawing this box around the main character, all of this stuff, even with the suggestion in the middle of this of the diagonal movement connecting to the main character, it's really creating a lot of competition for the main subject. And what are some things that that we could do? Well, we could do a couple of Photoshop things that I've mentioned. That I've done here, and I'm going to show you in just a second. One of the things I would say for me that's true about an image like this is, you could have somebody say that's just afraid to even critique an image, or thinks that the idea of critique or even talking about design is ridiculous. You might have them say, well, who cares? Abby cares. The reason I know that Abby cares is because of the title of this shot. And I could be wrong. It may be that everybody gets it, and it's not too busy. That's why if you actually care about communicating a specific concept, instead of just saying that you're so great that everyone should somehow psychically get what you're doing, then this is the kind of thing where you get feedback from more than one person. The other thing that I would say about a shot like this is how big this is printed is going to have a huge effect on whether people get it. And let's say that you want to tell stories that require the viewer to do some work, which I think is cool. It's a great idea. But I think that you could help the viewer in a shot like this by making a very big print. I think you could help the viewer even more by making this very big print and having a show or a book or a presentation with a lot of big prints, and then name the show in a way where you're essentially saying that these are stories. These shots are stories. And so the viewer knows there's a story, and then they stop and they say, okay, what all is going on here at the level of story? It may be even the kind of show where you have a little flap that hangs down over the title, and the viewer is encouraged to come up and look and sort of tell themselves a story, and then they reveal the title to maybe get more information and go back and have another look. But to me, at least for my own taste, this is one that either needs to be simplified visually or it needs to be presented in a context that will make it easier for the viewer to get what's going on. I mean, the other thing that I could say is that if this was even more dramatic over here, there's someone helping somebody, there's a group of people, there's even more energy that's happening in this corner, that might help too. All I did was I came in and I darkened the sky. Next most visually powerful thing besides high contrast is just bright. So I cut down on those big negative space shapes that were as bright. I also got rid of contrast in here, the bottom of the stage, and simplified that. And I got rid of this line that cuts off the corner and blocks this diagonal movement. I did all that on one layer. And then the other thing that I think you could do, and I've done a hideous rough job of this, is I think that you could correct the keystoning on the building but leave the keystoning on the person. The energy of the person does match the buildings, and Abby mentioned liking that in his backstory, but in my opinion the reality is if the person's leaning in and everything else is dead on the level, the contrast will make the main subject come forward even more. So here's a very rough version of what I'm talking about. Person is leaning in, everything else. I did a horrible job of correcting the keystoning. There's a way to do it where you don't have the reverse keystoning in the middle of the shot. Here's the other thing I mentioned at last critique. What if we flip this? Because from a cinematic standpoint, we're used to the good guys coming in from the left. And if we're talking about movement on this diagonal, if we got to do like this from bottom to top, it's easier once we get to this person for them to be moving up on a diagonal from the lower left to the top right. That's the number 2 easiest way to move on a diagonal. This is number 1. This is number 2. So let's just flip this. Go to image, image rotation, flip canvas horizontal. Let that sit there for a second. And in my opinion, in this flipped version, when you do get to the person down here, for me, you're much more likely to imagine them moving over in this direction than you are if when you get to them in this version, you've got to move against the grain. So just some interesting things to think about. Love to hear your feedback. I love Abby's idea here. I love the fact that he stopped. I love including the person and creating a story out of this shot. Love the black and white tones in this. Very beautiful. Really neat story shot. I want to thank Abby for sharing this image with us on the Mindful Eyes Daily Critique.